Continuing the Chronicles of Hildegoth, the First by Stuart Staub, copyright 2017, all rights reserved worldwide. The goddess of death was once a teacher. Unable to have children of her own, she instead spent her life showing children the first few real steps to take in life up until the day of her death. Amon reasoned that someone as well versed as she in the simple intricacies of life would be the perfect goddess of death, Caesara. Not a cold, heartless spectre who reminds us with an empty-socketed glare that we will all someday be maggot fodder, but a gentle guide to show us where life leads after it ends. A slurred, harsh lisp split the air. "Well, looky here, it's Jerem, the scummiest rat that ever slept in his own filth. How many sailors have you peddled yourself to lately, Jerry boy?" The grubby blacksmith's comments raised a raucous slew of laughter from his drunken table-mates. Jerem, standing just outside the door, sheathed in the skirts of the night and barely visible, merely turned eyes like a pair of needles on them and smiled. It was a smile that both chided and beckoned. It was not what the blacksmith had been expecting. He instantly sprang to his feet, fists clenched. He was a huge trunk of a man, his arms corded and bulging from a lifetime of twisting metal into shapes nature never intended. "I told you, you little freak, I aren't interested in that skinny little backside of yours, unless you need it beat, eh?" The night was overcast and full of muggy anxiety. Nearly midnight, the bar had all but emptied, save for the blacksmith's table. Jerem had been walking by on a strip of dock on which he had often frequented his wares. The crude man's strut normally would have sent him scurrying for a hole in which to find safety. Instead, he stopped and stared at the hulking man. He smiled again and took a step forward without a trace of fear. The blacksmith, unbelieving and enraged with his audacity, drew a wicked-looking knife from his belt. "What a turn of events, eh, lads? Jerry the Spitlicker's found a spark of man inside of him that ain't been buggered out yet." And he waved the knife in a fluid series of arcs that spoke of a skilled knife fighter. His friends laughed and cheered for Jerem to take him on. The blacksmith edged a couple of steps toward the young man. The barkeep, having had too good a day for it to end badly, simply closed off the window that allowed him access to patrons and vanished into the back. Jerem watched the man as he moved in measured steps to close the distance between them. He showed not a trace of fear or anger. In fact, his face was still twisted into a grin. The smith had seen this look before, but could not recall when or where until he was an arm's length away from him. His appearance then became clear and was all the more horrible because of this clarity. Jerem's skin was inert and leathery. The black hair on his head was knotted and unkempt. His lips were dry and withered, and he appeared as though he had gone without water for days. The blacksmith was beginning to have doubts about his choice now. Had the little prostitute's line of work found him with some horrible malady? He looked up at his eyes, wondering if they were glazed with madness, and a terrible fear gripped his belly. The man's eyes were the only aspect of his form that showed true life. They were lit from within by an unholy light that made them appear as flakes of emerald shot through with frozen lightning. He suddenly remembered what the condition of Jerem's body resembled, that of a corpse that had been left to the mercy of the sun. He had seen similar sorts floating in on a schooner that had been caught in a squall in deep waters and broken its mainsail. After a few days, the crew had exhausted its supplies of food and water. Hailed and boarded long after the last seaman had perished, the cadavers, far from any carrion-eaters, looked like clothed leather skeletons with teeth and shoes. Only this one, now stepping from the murky shadows, was moving. The smith felt a scream rising from his belly. Jerem smiled once more, his lips splitting far wider than a man's possibly could, showing black gums and teeth like old bones. Like a snapping tether, his hand flashed out, knocking the blade from the larger man's hand and splintering his wrist. Now the smith really did scream, a high-pitched shriek that seemed utterly unbearable to the man who had produced it. The others stood at the table behind him, looks of confusion and rage painted on their faces. Jerem then grasped the man by his underarms and quite simply tore the front of his chest off. A bucket's worth of blood splashed the flooring, and the blacksmith's eyes rolled into his head. Collapsing like a net loosed from a hook, he fell to the ground. The other sailor's face quickly melted into terror as they saw the diminutive dock horse standing in the doorway with a broad belt of still dripping human flesh in his hands, grinning from ear to ear. He spread his hands, tearing the piece of meat in two, and spoke to the other men in a voice as smooth and unblemished as a sheet of crystal at the bottom of a spring stream. "Would you die?" he asked the others at the table. Their fear locked away any answer they may have had tight in their throats. The monstrosity casually advanced a handful of steps. "Would you die?" again passed its lips. The closest of them, a thin and pockmarked seaman, let slip a strangled wail of despair and terror as he locked eyes with it. The thing that was once Jerem nodded and held out its hand. The sailor, seemingly against his will, stared at the outstretched fingers that looked like old cowhide and stumbled forward, his own hand reaching out and clasping it. As if sustaining a blow to the face, the filthy man jerked in place, his eyes wide and his features peeled back with fear. Then, like a cloud cloaking the moon, his face relaxed. The other two men, still frozen with shock at the spectacle before them, gaped at their former shipmate. His flesh seemed to wilt as if bathed in great heat, though it did not catch flame. His hair fell in clumps to the floor, and his clothing began to drape over his shrunken form like a large cloak on a small child. Then it contracted to a stretched and wrinkled covering that seemed to barely conceal the form beneath it that it once did naturally. He stood, leaning slightly from side to side, facing Jerem. One of the others finally found his voice, choked and stricken though it was. "What are you? What the hells are you?" Jerem released its victim's hand, and both he and the newly formed monstrosity faced the remaining two. The sailor's eyes were like that of Jerem's now, sparkling motes of green hate, though not nearly as bright. The hand that had gripped Jerem's and had changed him thus was a withered claw, dry except for the nails, which dripped an amber fluid. His mouth parted in an obscene smile. With a voice unlike his master's, a voice like broken pottery scraped across ice, he addressed his former mates. "Would you die?" They knew then that it was not a warning, but an invitation, and that the stick-like simulacrum of humanity that had smiled at them with an impossible smile was not Jerem at all. Passers-by were few and drunk, but even these muddled shufflers felt their senses pricked and their wits sharpened at the gurgling screams cut short that poured forth from the confines of the foul little tavern. Several hours later, the diseased flock of followers had grown considerably. They slipped through the shadowy blankets of darkness that lay behind every shop, every inn, every warehouse, and every brothel. Near these establishments were more wasted souls that were ripe for the plucking. Each new member was added in the same manner as the one that preceded it, and not one was able to resist his hideous temptation. All fell with equal effort, which was hardly any at all. The creatures shambled restlessly yet quietly through the night, embracing more into their grotesque fellowship, killing some outright and avoiding others. Large groups of armed members were still too mighty to fall easily to their wiles. "Soon," the once Jerem would croon to them, "soon, my little ones." few hours before dawn, they all went to ground near a reeking stretch of beach where the stench of dead fish and sodden seaweed was strong enough to gag even an old sailor. No one would bother them there. The gathered ones, beyond mortal but still limited, needed rest, but their creator did not. It lay there, eyes parted in the sand, thinking, brooding, and plotting. This was hardly the first shuffle of the first step, but had finally begun, and the world awaited. The town was not very large, as he had expected. It lay partially shrouded under the fringes of an old oak forest, though the farmhouses were on relatively flat land near a small river, where pulley systems lifted water from it to their crops. It was a quiet, comforting scene, one with which Gibran was nearly alien. People stared at him with unabashed curiosity, but for some reason bordered on scornful. He sauntered Grendel along, fairly used to the odd looks he and his ugly old warhorse received, but this seemed excessive. He abandoned such thoughts when Wendenell waved and called out by name to some of the townspeople. Mostly her greetings were met with a nervous nod or nothing at all. One even dropped what he was doing and ran to a nearby cottage. So it was not he who was causing the volatile glares, or at least not solely. It was the children as well. It was all very, very odd. He asked softly, "What town is this anyway?" "This is Camder, and this is our house," she said suddenly. Gibran pulled back on the reins, and Grendel obeyed with only a small huff of complaint at the abrupt halt. Wendenell hopped off without his help. Fabius was not so certain. The old warrior got off his horse and lifted him down to the ground as if he weighed nothing. The boy beamed up at him. There was a flash, and Gibran was staring down at another boy-child, his face smudged with dirt, and there were 2 front teeth absent from his smile, making it that much more precious. "Hurry home, Dada," the straw-haired youth mouthed to him, though he couldn't hear the words. He reached a hand out to muss his hair, a gesture that was familiar and long lost. A loud shout erupted from behind him. "Wendenell! Fabius!" That strand to his distant past was snapped instantly. He caught himself with his hand half raised towards Fabius's head, who had shown no fear at such an action. He lowered it quickly, for the shout had to have been the father, returned early from whatever current service his employ with the magistrate entailed. He turned to face him, attempting to put on a friendly smile. A bearded man nearly as large as he, clad in thick mail covered over with a dull red tunic, stomped up to him. Obviously unperturbed by confrontation, the man barked a demand. "Who the hells are you, and what are you doing with my daughter and son?" Gibran clenched his jaw, but remained calm. "A traveler. I found your children out near Graydon's Wood." The man's eyes broadened slightly. "They told me where they were from, so I decided that it would be best to bring them home." Wendenell stared at the side of his head, wondering why Gibran had not told her father about the mean-looking monster things. She wanted to voice her curiosity, but decided against it. The man's bullish demeanor dreamed away. He sighed and stepped back, looking rather abashed at his outburst. "Graydon's Wood? By the gods, you two are impossible to contain." They giggled and ran to him, throwing their arms around his waist. He chuckled back to them. Gibran, a bit put off by the man's acceptance of their misbehavior, silently reminded himself that it had been many, many years since he had been a father. It did not seem appropriate for him to judge this man. Still, he seemed far too accommodating to the little devils. The man broke away from his children and extended a gnarled, calloused hand. Appreciating this, at least, Gibran took it and shook firmly. "My apologies for my little outburst. I am Derek Thresher, and you, my friend." He tried to avoid giving his name out too often, but he could not give a false one since he had already told the children. At least the fellow seemed well-meaning. Gibran Marshada, an honor, Derek. The man shook his head and closed his eyes briefly. No, Gibran, the honor and pleasure are mine. My thanks are yours. He released Gibran's hand and glared at his offspring with mock fury. My thanks for tending to my two hellions, who, though they can read better than a priest, can amazingly forget their boundaries as if they were as sharp-witted as an upside-down fence post. They giggled. Gibran did not. Why don't you come in, Gibran? I'd love to hear of any tales your travels have learned you. What do you say? Without waiting for an answer, he turned and headed for his cottage. It was a respectably sizable structure of whitewashed mud, plaster, and timber, and roofed with neat fired clay slates. A nearby stand of oaks cast shade over most of it and the neighboring houses, but unbroken sunlight struck to the south, where a patch of fenced-in ground enclosed the even rows of a large vegetable garden. Along the furthest fence were 3 small trees, each bearing different fruit. At the corner nearest the house was a tall-roofed well with a trough running from its lip to a delicately tiered garden. Buckets of water could be drawn from its recesses and dumped down the trough, where it would wind its way around the vegetables. It was all in all a clever setup. Gibran murmured quietly for Grendel to stay nearby. The horse chuffed a response and wandered over to a nearby patch of thick, succulent grass. As the old warrior neared the door, he noticed that, other than a riding horse, there was not a single animal to be seen on the Thresher homestead, unlike the other farmhouses. Some farms did keep animals for what they could produce other than their meat, such as chickens for eggs and cows or goats for milk. This little family had neither. He smiled a bit at the thought. He had forsaken meat decades ago, for its taste could stir something in his soul that he would prefer remained dormant. It seemed odd to him that there he was, a vegetarian invited into a household where meat must be, at least, a rarity. Perhaps it was dependent upon the guest. The inside of the cottage was nondescript, but pretty in its minimal way. There was a thick fired clay and stone hearth, blackened with years of use, against the wall opposite the door. Along another wall ran a low set of bookshelves crammed with tomes and texts and all other manner of reading materials. Near it was a writing desk with lead styluses, quills, inkpots, and a small stack of paper. The main living area showed a low table at its center with a small sofa on one side and a large stuffed leather chair on the other. In one corner of the room was a wooden chair, most likely for guests. Derek motioned towards the larger one, a gesture of very considerate kindness, as it was obviously the head of the households. Gibran accepted it graciously. He got a nod and a friendly smile in return. Wendell and Fabius sat on the sofa. They both maintained perfect posture despite being in the comforts of their own home. Going back many years to his childhood, Gibran admitted to himself that he could not recall being that well-mannered. Derek went through the right door of 2 along the southern wall. Gibran took a deep breath, folded his arms across his chest, and pondered. He really wasn't the social type. He could appreciate all the trappings and goings-on of civilized life, but only in a distant, observational sense. He had given up his part in it long ago. He felt out of place in everywhere but nowhere, even in a home nearly empty of everything but family, and even when that family welcomed him in. He must have started scowling because Wendell suddenly piped in. "What are you thinking of when you do that?" she asked. He shook his attention away from his brooding. "What?" "You heard me," she managed to reply without a trace of insolence. Besides, she was right. He shrugged. "Nothing, really." He had hardly closed his mouth when she said, "If it's nothing, then why do you get so mad when you think about it?" "You ask a lot of questions," he muttered out the corner of his mouth. "And you don't give very good answers," she said sweetly. Just then Derek returned. Gibran felt literally rescued. "Maybe it's because he does not like to, Wendy. Did you think of that?" He said this as he placed a large wooden tray laden with fresh fruits and vegetables on the table. Gibran's mouth watered. Help yourself, my friend. There's plenty more. Thank you, Derek. You're very kind. He reached for a plump tomato nearly the size of his fist. Derek chuckled again. And you are very patient. You must be. He inclined his head towards his children. They're still alive. Aye, they are a bit of a handful. They are a bit of two handfuls. Wendenell and Fabius giggled and munched on carrots and radishes. Gibran took a bite of the tomato and found it delicious. It was lightly coated with a tasty oil glaze that was peppery and garlicky and sweet all at once. He raised his eyes and questioned to Derek. A very simple oil and seasoning glaze that my wife used to make, his host said. Takes only moments to prepare and will keep indefinitely, or until it's gone. Gibran nodded as he took another bite of the sumptuous fruit and looked around again with both his eyes and his nose. The room was full of smells that were new but rapidly becoming familiar as he acclimated. His eyes found a small painting hanging on the wall over the hearth. It was a very slender woman, so thin she almost looked sickly, and she was absolutely lovely. She had Wendenell's nose and Fabius's lips, or rather, they had hers. It could only have been their mother. Gibran indicated the painting with a small nod. Your wife? He asked. He smiled and reached for a radish. Yes, her name was Arya. She died. Your children told me, Gibran said quietly. Derek nodded. Yes, they have had to become quite reliant on each other. With me spending days at a time guarding the magistrate on this or that important outing, my time at home has been spotty at best. I had in fact been relieved early by my replacement and only just returned home when you rode up. He chewed slowly and was quiet for a moment. Then his eyes perked up. I think we need drink to go with this fine meal. Gibran, I take it you would appreciate a fresh ale? The broad old warrior nodded and grinned. Absolutely. Derek approved, as would I. Babe, Wendy, draw us each a flagon, would you? And get yourself something as well. They both hopped to their feet and rushed to the kitchen. Gibran and Derek continued to munch on the heaping platter. I notice that you do not ask why I serve no meat, Derek commented. Gibran shrugged. A man's house is run the way he sees fit. It would be unseemly to question your tastes at any table, much less your own. There is a reason, you know. I am certain that it is a good one, sir, Gibran replied, attempting to imply that Derek need not explain anything. It is. You are too polite to ask, so I'll go ahead and tell you. He turned and looked at the painting of his wife. It was Arya, really. She died of some sort of family malady associated with the eating of meat of any kind. It causes an infection in the stomach that literally makes them waste away to nothing. By the time its presence was discovered, the damage it had done to her body was irreversible. Ron listened with a slightly unsettled feeling. This fellow certainly was quick at becoming comfortable with strangers. He was sympathetic, but it was difficult to let this be known, especially to another man. Derek continued. I had simply thought that she was frail in health. She had looked thin for as long as I had known her. He looked down and plucked a celery stalk from the platter. As it turns out, Wendenell is afflicted with the same illness. Fabius might be as well, but I am not sure. I dare not risk his health for the satisfaction of mere curiosity. Regardless, there has not been a sliver of meat in this house for 6 years. He peered away at nothing, ever since she died. Gibran swallowed hard. Wendenell, is she... Derek shook his head. It was caught very early. She is in perfect health and will remain so as long as she sticks to her vegetarian diet. She was so young when I made the transition that she hardly remembers what eating meat was like. Gibran said, She seems very happy. So does the boy, despite his inability to talk. Again, Derek shook his head. It is not an inability. He simply chooses not to speak. The night Arya died, she told him, Let no words of regret pass these lips. He was only 3, but he has hardly uttered a word since. I think he believes that nothing but repentance will fall from his lips if he were to speak, so he keeps silent. He briefly raised one palm, and then dropped it in his lap. I really do not know. The only one who does is he. Braun took a slow, quiet breath, taking this all in. After all his gloomy recollections of war and its atrocities, he had quite nearly forgotten that pain and loss touches everyone everywhere, even here in this loving father's and widower's home. Derry, you may have already noticed that I am not very good with words as well, though it is much more clumsiness with them than anything else. All I can really think to say is that I'm sorry for what you have lost, and I mean more than your wife. He opened his mouth as if to continue, but could not think of anything more to say, so he went back to eating. Derrick's eyes turned into tiny mirrors in which Gibran could plainly see himself. Kind of words have not been said to me in quite some time, Gibran. He smiled thinly in a manner that showed a tired, lonely man who had made the best of the world with which he had been left, and had done quite well with it. Then the children returned. He cleared his throat, took a large mug of ale lightly from his daughter while planting a kiss on her cheek for her efforts, and then regaled Gibran with an enthusiasm that shattered the awkward, melancholy moment. Enough with this sappy horse scat. What tales of the world have you brought to our fire tonight, O man of the open road? They all shared a laugh, the men's baritones mingling with Wendenel's and Fabius's tinkling silver giggles. Then, slowly and dramatically, Fabius pointed at the hearth. There was no fire. They laughed again, even louder this time. The old war-weary Gibran felt a warmth bloom in his heart that had not been there since a time that was more than a man's life ago. It was an existence so delicately shelved in his memory that he had, at times, been uncertain that he had even taken part in it. It was an existence where he, too, had been a father and a husband, more than 300 years ago. That is the conclusion of Chapter 4. My apologies for not leading with that.